I'm Katrina Onstad, the producer of Lately.
And I'm Vass Bednar, the host. Katrina, do you want to hear a joke?
I always want to hear a joke.
Okay. A machine learning algorithm walks into a bar. The bartender asks, "What'll you have?" And the algorithm says, "Well, what's everyone else having?"
Okay, that's a good joke. And I didn't laugh out loud, but I was laughing internally.
Can we edit in like a drum roll or something? That's what we need. So credit where credit's due. That joke is from a Google engineer named Chet Hayes, and it was quoted in Kyle Shaka's book, Filter World. But it got us thinking, what does it mean when we say that we like something?
Right. Do we even know what we like anymore, or are we just following the digital herd?
Right.
This is the age of quantification, right? Every movie, book, the songs we listen to, everything we take in is determined by platforms, aggregating other people's reviews and numerical measurements of quality, which we've talked about a little bit on this show. But this week, we wanted to go deeper into whether or not it matters that we're all having what everyone else is having, as the joke goes.
Yeah, we're going to get a better understanding of the impact of technology on this lost art of criticism and take a big look at how all this measuring is affecting our taste. So our guest this week is a cultural critic, Lauren Euler. You may have read her work in The New Yorker or Vice or BuzzFeed back in the day, or you may know her fiction. Her novel, Fake Accounts, came out in the pandemic. You're most likely to know her for her very sharp, fearless reviews of writers like Roxane Gay and Gia Tolentino. I don't know if you remember this, Katrina, but her scathing review of Tolentino's essay collection, Trick Mirror, crashed the London Review of Books website.
I do remember that. Yeah, she writes about her peers, these very famous writers, and she's not always as infatuated with them as the consensus dictates. And for that, she has received an outsized share of online hate, actually. And she talked to you about that. Mm-hmm. I thought it was very interesting when she was describing what it's like to be called an ice queen online. But she seems to have a very thick skin.
Yeah. Euler's newest book, No Judgment, is a collection of 6 essays. They're all about the role of criticism in a changing, increasingly algorithm-centered world. And she's kind of a throwback, right? Lauren's writing criticism in a moment where criticism has drastically changed. It's being diluted. We have this terrible loss of full-time professional critics that are anchored at newspapers and magazines, and the growth of peer review platforms happening at the same time, like Goodreads, Rotten Tomatoes, platforms like Letterboxd. These all sort of supplant the kind of work that she does, but in a very different and distinct way.
Yeah, a big chunk of this book dissects the Goodreads phenomenon.
Yeah. And if you're not familiar with Goodreads, it's kind of a cataloging website. It has a social element where you can share a lot about your reading. You can highlight a book you're currently reading. And if you like, once you've read a book, you can also review it. Lauren says that this isn't criticism. It's more of a customer review.
And it does have an economic impact on publishing, right? 150 million users in 2023. Amazon bought it. And these reviews link directly to Amazon, where you can buy these books. And Amazon is responsible for over 50% of book sales in the United States.
There's also just like the trolling. People may have fake accounts that they weaponize or terrorize peers, authors, even trying to extinguish the power of popular reviewers.
Yeah, we saw last year was really interesting. The author, Elizabeth Gilbert, huge writer, Eat, Pray, Love. She's a brand. Mm-hmm. And a book of hers, which was set in Russia and hadn't even been published yet, got targeted by a group of Ukrainian readers to the point where she was so uncomfortable that she pulled the book from publication. The book actually wasn't published. So there's a real world effect, that evidence of the clout and the power of Goodreads. When the crowd turns, there's the dark side.
Well, Katrina, you're also an author. So do you look at your Goodreads?
I do not look at my Goodreads, and I know that that's actually a problem for my publishers and probably for my career. I don't know if I could bear it. I think there's something really positive about the idea of a community of readers who are books for, right? If not for the people who read them. And there is this argument that Goodreads shifts the power to readers and away from what I always picture in my head is like Anton Ego, the Ratatouille capital C critic. And I get that. But for me, reading and writing fiction is more of a solitary, almost a sacred act. To me, it's not quantifiable, right? So it makes me kind of grumpy to see artists' work reduced to a star rating.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Vass, before we go, can I tell you a joke? Can we come full circle here?
Okay.
This is a joke that has to do with what we're talking about today. Why did the yogurt go to the art exhibition?
Okay. Yogurt, to see if it was dairy-free, art, fermented.
Okay, you're thinking way too hard.
Why did the yogurt go-gurt? I don't know. Why?
Because it was cultured.
Man.
You didn't even laugh. It's a
Cultured.
terrible joke, but the internet told me it was funny, so I believed it.
Yogurt went to the art show so it could tell you how many stars the Mona Lisa gets.
Exactly.
And that's kind of the whole problem. Let's talk to Lauren Euler. This is Lately. Lauren, when did you know that you had good taste?
I remember very distinctly that I was made fun of in middle school for not knowing what was on MTV, not knowing what was on TRL and all this kind of stuff. So then I got one of these little 13-inch televisions with a VHS for some birthday. And so I watched MTV studiously so that I would know what, in the context of rural West Virginia, what people were talking about and what was cool, quote unquote. And then I went to an elite Ivy League university where people knew about a lot of different things that I had never heard of before.
Mm-hmm.
And it was quite difficult for me to understand what was good and what was not, because I think I really didn't read a good book until I went to college.
Mm.
But I think one of my arguments in general is that taste can be learned. And I think there's this idea that taste should be innate and that it's inauthentic to try. But the classic thing we talk about with taste is taste in clothing. And some of the best dressers I know, they're thinking quite a lot about it. And I think taste is a lot of the time about someone's willingness to put in the intellectual effort to think about why they like what they like or why they dislike what they dislike, right?
Yeah, and all thank you to MTV. I wanted to start with taste and learn about your history developing your sense of your own, because I'm so interested in how technology shapes and reshapes daily lives, often in ways that we don't quite notice or we feel but we don't talk about. And you have written about how we live in this painfully quantitative world now, where what we like and what we don't like is increasingly shaped by the comments and experiences of others, reviews, rankings, and sometimes an algorithmic interpretation. I'm thinking the aggregation of Rotten Tomatoes and others. So how is quantification, how is technology changing our taste?
Well, I think there are two things happening with technology. On the one hand, you have these sort of algorithmic recommendation generators, basically, something like Spotify, something like Netflix, and to a lesser extent, Goodreads, Amazon, social media in general, right? So algorithms are guiding you to things that you've already liked. That means, on one hand, the rich get richer, the popular get more popular, because what is popular often is catering to the lowest common denominator so that the most people like it, so that you can make the most money off of it. Another thing that's happening that I think, it could be a good thing for taste if people are willing to put in the work, right? You can encounter sometimes these local internet communities, right?
What is a local internet community?
On social media, I'm friends with another literary critic who tweets a lot about 20th and 21st century European literature.
Okay.
And he has a stable of followers, most of whom he has not met in person, who are also interested in 20th and 21st century European literature. And if you read Ulysses and you're like, I want to read more things that are like Ulysses, and you sort of Google around and you might find these guys talking about weird modernist poetry or anything like that. But that requires a certain initiative, right? That requires you to sit down and say, I'm going to watch MTV all day so that I learn what's cool. So I think that if we start thinking about taste as something that one can cultivate or as something that one can develop and as something that indeed can be judged, it might encourage more people to use the internet in the way that utopian technologists maybe thought it might be used, which is to say, to use it to find strange work online. And the same is true for film too, right? Like there's the amazing platform Mubi for independent cinema, also the Criterion Channel. But you can get like a true education in cinema by using these platforms. So I think there's long been an idea that highbrow stuff, art house cinema, like difficult literature, they're sort of the realm of the elite. And if you don't like Taylor Swift or something, you're a snob.
Right.
But actually, this is the great thing about culture, or it could be in the 21st century, is that you can learn a lot for free using the internet.
The title of your book of essays is No Judgment. And you, of course, play with this and, tell us how it's a phrase that can be read a few different ways. It's kind of like the ultimate passive-aggressive conversational move. Could you talk a little bit more about that, why judgment matters?
Sure. So I was writing these essays and I wanted to write one about the concept of vulnerability, which I was encountering a lot, both in arts criticism as well as in my day-to-day life as a person who's online and talking to people of my milieu and my age groups. I'm 33 years old. I'm a millennial.
I'm a geriatric millennial.
Ah, that's great. I think that's a great micro generation to be in. You've got enough Gen X, but not too much. Basically, we use the phrase no judgment to sort of forestall any criticism. And it's just completely unrealistic. Like, we're judging all the time. And if you're talking to someone and they say no judgment, you know that that's not true at some level, right? Like, we're judging all the time. The idea also sort of relates to the trend that we've seen over the last 10, 15 years for like identity politics and identity-related critique. So what has happened is that we understand taste to be merely a product of a person's circumstances. We say, oh, I like this movie because I related to it because as a woman, blah, 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 blah. I related to this movie because as a person of color, blah, 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 blah. I find this way of thinking about taste to be incredibly limiting because it says you can't like things that aren't in your little group. And if you dislike something that is pandering to your identity group or groups, that means you're a traitor, right?
Or you're discounting those groups in some way. Or
yeah, exactly. You're insulting them. You're insulting them. They're being vulnerable and you're insulting them. And it also completely ignores any aesthetic critique whatsoever. And ultimately, it only harms the people who are part of those groups because it says you can't think. You can only react.
Right. I think it's definitely fair to say that cultural criticism had more power in the past, or a more distinct power. You're sort of pointing to that shift in power or the diffusion of it and maybe trying to call some of it back. Could you refresh us on what the role of a culture critic was in the past and maybe how you see cultural criticism changing for better or for worse in a kind of online environment?
Until very recently, the only way to really publicize the fact that you had a book or a film or an art exhibition coming out was through cultural criticism. So people would read the New York Times book review and say, oh, Lauren Euler has a collection of essays coming out. I think I remember reading one of her pieces in Harper's Magazine a couple of months ago. I will check that out. Now, you can still see a review of my book in the New York Times, but you can also Google it and you get a wide range, let's say, of reactions to the book. In order to sift through all this stuff, to understand that Lauren Euler is a genius and you should definitely buy her book, you have to have this kind of critical faculty or your ability to interpret information that's on the internet and on the social internet, right? Because you can't just say, oh, this guy hates her book, therefore that is true.
Right.
Whereas in the past, these kinds of institutions, people respected them a lot more, let's say. So if you had a good New York Times review, that sort of meant something. And it does still mean something, but we just have a lot more inputs now.
Okay. As the media landscape has continued to evolve and contract, there are fewer outlets for long-form criticism. You wrote for Vice. Vice went under recently, RIP. How much of this shift away from cultural criticism is just a business problem?
Well, with regard to the media, it has been very interesting. So this is my second book. I published a novel 3 years ago during COVID.
Yeah.
And even in the last 3 years, the way that I promote this book has changed completely, which is to say a lot of the websites that I would have done interviews with or places that would have reviewed this book don't exist anymore or are like severely limited in what they cover. And certainly there's an idea that books coverage does not generate the kind of traffic that you need to sustain your business. So if you're going to cut something, you're going to cut arts coverage first, I think. That's the sort of rationale of many business-minded media professionals. But something that is interesting is that I've been doing a lot of interviews or like guest spots on newsletters, which, especially with the demise of these websites, they are kind of coming into their own. And it's an interesting model for an individual because if you are successful, you can maybe afford to hire a fact checker or you can afford to hire an editor to work with you on like long pieces or whatever. And you have a really dedicated audience of 10,000 readers, say. And that's not the same kind of thing if you're writing for the New Yorker or something, like you don't have that access to that audience. But you can sort of sustain an independent practice that way if you are one of these people who succeed. Mm-hmm. Is it good? No, I don't think it's good. It just is what it is.
Yeah.
And it is certainly interesting to watch, I think, even if you're watching like through your fingers with your hands over your eyes.
Well, speaking of having your fingers over your eyes, you occupy two fascinating spaces. As you mentioned, you're a critic, but you're also an author who is subject to criticism yourself. Mm-hmm. Could you describe for me, like, what is it like as an author going to your computer or your phone or your iPad, looking up your first reviews on Goodreads when your novel came out?
You know, I never cared that much about it because of this kind of collapse of all books in all genres into this. It's like, it's a book. And it's like, well, no, you know, my novel is a literary novel. It's somewhat experimental. When editors were rejecting it, one of the grounds on which they rejected it was that it was a, quote, European novel because it takes place in Europe. And because I had a career like writing for magazines, I wasn't so concerned about what my Goodreads reviews said or meant. And because I have a career as a literary critic and I have a reputation for being somewhat harsh because I've written some negative book reviews. So whenever someone's writing an article about me, they're like, Lauren Euler, the feared literary critic. A German newspaper once called me, I'll translate it, a productive angel of death for contemporary literature.
Oh.
But because of that, I was very prepared to get traditional reviews, some of which would be negative because everybody wants to whack the piñata and dethrone the ice queen, right? So
ice queen.
Try again. Good luck.
Good luck, guys.
But this is all to say, like, I wasn't so worried about Goodreads because I had these people who were going to try and negatively review me in like a paper.
Okay. Well, you have a thick skin.
It stings. It doesn't feel good. It's not like I'm like impervious to criticism, but I do think that quite early on, I determined how to tell which criticism is something I should actually think about and consider and like what is a true weakness and which is just like being made because people like just saying stuff, you know?
Yeah.
So on Goodreads and on social media in general, it's a lot of people just saying stuff and it's totally their right. And I think like it's good. Like people should have outlets for their opinions about things. However, is it the law? No. And, you know, this is a cliche, but a lot of cliches are true, which is like, what doesn't kill you make you stronger. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, I used to work at Vice, and I wrote a lot of articles that were online-only articles during kind of the peak of the digital media clickbait era. I like saw a lot of people saying mean things about me. And I think that helps you develop a thick skin. And also I think that, of course, there are many people who couldn't do it and don't want to do it. And that's perfectly fine as well. I don't think that everybody should want to be a quasi-public figure because it is quite unpleasant. But, you know, sometimes people are like, why are you like this? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know why.
You responded to an early review of your book through a very casual tweet. Why should artists engage with their critics, if at all? What was making that decision like?
So on a sort of spiritual, theoretical, like grand artistic level, yes, I believe that artists and critics should be having conversations. And I believe that artists and critics should really believe what they're saying and be able to defend it, right? And so I'm happy to get into an argument with someone who doesn't like my work if that person were like trying to read it in good faith. the review that you're talking about, which was in The Observer, was not done in good faith, but it did come out at a particularly useful time for me in terms of publicity. I think it came out like 2 or even 3 weeks before my book was going to be published in the UK. And the kind of publicity dictum is like, do not respond to criticism because it's going to make you look bad. It's going to make you look like you have thin skin. In this case, I reasonably assumed that if I were to draw attention to this ridiculous review, a lot of people would agree that this was done in very bad faith and it was sort of crossing a kind of line that I believe is unacceptable. And what she said in this review, she insinuated that I was lying about being tall. She called me a poor little squirrel. Like, you know, she did all this kind of stuff where a lot of people review books in bad faith, but they don't like insult the author. And because of that, I did respond and I just tweeted, here are some things that this person says that are sort of ridiculous. And that made everybody talk about my book. So that's why I did it, right? Like, you know, I've gotten lots of bad reviews and I don't draw attention to them. But in this case, I made a kind of evil PR calculation.
I was going to say, on the flip side, what do you say to the don't be such a snob crowd who doesn't think that the end of cultural criticism as we knew it is anything to actually worry about?
Well, it's not that they think it's nothing to worry about because they think it should die, right? So don't be such a snob is like, why do you like this kind of difficult stuff that threatens me? I think that that is kind of the psychology behind that kind of comment. Or like, don't criticize Marvel movies because many people enjoy them. Don't criticize Taylor Swift because many people enjoy her. You're sexist if you criticize Taylor Swift because teenage girls like her. Again, that is a sort of conflation of who we are with what we like. And my feeling is, I think that people should be empowered, at least in the realm of culture, because they're so disempowered in terms of like their housing, their health insurance, their ability to afford food, and their ability to affect political change, that there's no need to give up cultural ground as well. There can be many great things in culture. It's not like we have to elect the culture president every 4 years and he dictates the policies about who you should like and who we don't like or whatever.
So maybe we could just touch on another real-world example of the collapse of criticism with Pitchfork folding into GQ. Pitchfork really mattered, especially for, I think, Canadian bands, right? Real music critics writing lengthy reviews. Industry and music lovers followed it quite closely. This is a throwback too, but we wouldn't have like Arcade Fire or Broken Social Scene seeing the success that they did and they have without Pitchfork. But what does Pitchfork's demise tell us about where we are with criticism, and does the end of Pitchfork matter for music?
This is an issue in every aspect of culture. Like there are literary magazines closing, like magazines that used to be dedicated to books, and websites as well that have vanished. I think something that is interesting about Pitchfork is that many serious music people would have said the demise of Pitchfork happened long ago. And many people believe that Pitchfork sort of sold out to poptimism. So you get these long theoretical essays about Taylor Swift using like Foucault or whatever. And to me, that seems like a waste of energy. So my question basically is, did they cede their ground when they sort of soften and try to appeal to masses who are never going to read Pitchfork anyway, right? Like maybe the Swifties are going to find your bad review of one of her albums and yell at your social media manager.
I feel like Swifties will find where you live and like geolocate you as well.
Yeah, the actual audience for serious criticism is much smaller than like a general audience, and it should be. I think this idea that we need to pander to like the kind of average consumer in order to save our skin is sort of misguided, because the people that you need to attract are people who are going to be interested in serious criticism, who are going to be interested in like music reviews as an intellectual exercise and talking about an album in depth. I have to believe, because I am kind of an optimist, that there are possible untapped audiences of people who would like serious criticism, who basically are not being served. And the issue is kind of a nonstop growth mindset. Like we relentlessly have to be growing all the time. And therefore we just need to be constantly getting more and more readers. And then you lose the readers who are more likely to spend money on you because they like actually like your publication and they care about publications as publications, as opposed to like people who are just clicking around.
Just clicking around. I want to round out and just also ask, in this vacuum, does the algorithm or do algorithms become an even more powerful force in our lives? What do algorithms do to taste? They seem like they could be part of this depreciation or flattening that you point to, but they could also surface tougher quality, obscure material that we hope for.
Yeah, I think it would be better not to have them, but certainly they're not all bad. But I find incredibly weird music on Spotify because I only listen to basically like niche dance music, like historical and present, like techno, house, disco stuff. So you often find like really weird stuff in your Spotify algorithm. And I listen to like Lebanese pop from the 60s because I am like one of these like coastal elitists, right? So my algorithms are trained effectively. My Instagram algorithm is terrible because I don't really use Instagram for anything except for like looking at clothes and like puppies. But you can also train your algorithms. But then that requires a sense of agency and like active participation in your online life. And I think like many people don't have that because my job is to like kind of be on the internet a lot of the time and see what's going on. And for some people, you know, that's not their job. And that's good because we can't all just sit around on our phones assessing the state of culture. So, yeah.
Lauren, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to Lately, a Globe and Mail podcast. Our executive producer is Katrina Onstad. The show is produced by Andrea Varsany, and our sound designer is Cameron McIver. I'm your host, Vass Bednar. And in our show notes, you can subscribe to the Lately newsletter, where we unpack a little more of the latest in business and technology. A new episode of Lately comes out every Friday, wherever you get your podcasts.